The tower was round and old and built of pale stone, gone grey, with the desert's patience. Eddard Stark stood in its shadow with the sun still climbing above the red mountains and blood drying on his hands, and from somewhere above him came a sound that did not belong to the dead. A child's cry, thin and new. He had come to this pass with 7 men. He was leaving with one. Before the tower's door lay Willem Dustin, Ethan Glover, Martin Castle, Theo Wool, and Mark Ricewell. Good men who had ridden south because he had asked them to. Beside them lay 3 Kingsguard, Arthur Dane, Oswell Whent, Gerald Hightower, men who had made their choices long before this morning, and could not be blamed for keeping to them. Ned had built cairns for all 8, because no one would come to do it if he did not. Only Howland Reed had walked away with him. The Crannogman stood at Ned's side now, small and dark and very still. Not empty, but thinking, the way men from the Neck thought. He had said nothing since the fighting ended. They climbed the stairs. At the top, they found her. Lyanna Stark was 17 years old, and looked older. She lay in a bed that was dark with what it had cost her, her dark hair plastered to her face, her grey eyes, the same eyes Ned saw in the mirror every morning, the same eyes all the Starks carried, fixed on him with a focus that spent itself as he watched.
Ned?
Her voice was barely there. He knelt beside her. The child in the nearby cradle went on crying, unknowing. Ned did not look at it. He held his sister's hand, and she told him what she needed him to know. She had not been taken. He had to understand that first, before the rest. Rhaegar had not taken her. They had married, quietly in Dorne, before a Septon, before the gods, a real marriage, witnessed and binding. Not a bastard, true-born. His heir, and by right of succession, the heir to the Iron Throne, and if Robert Baratheon ever learned the boy existed, there would be no trial, no hesitation, no mercy. At the end she looked at him very directly. "Promise me, Ned. I promise," he said. She died before the sun had moved much past mid-morning. He brought the child down himself. The boy was small and loud in the way new things are loud when they have just discovered air, and he had hair as dark as Lyanna's, as dark as Ned's own, as dark as every Stark-born in the last 1,000 years. Nothing that would make a man think of dragon lords or the family Robert's war had finished. The child's eyes were grey and new, and saw nothing yet. "He looks like us," Howland said. "Yes," Ned said it quietly. "He does." It was the only mercy the world had given them. It would not be enough on its own. Howland sat on the ground floor stones and was quiet for a time, thinking, not absent, and then he said what Ned had been thinking since the fighting ended. "You mean to take him north? Say he's yours. Catelyn will believe it. For a while. Robert will visit Winterfell. Robert has people everywhere, and some of them remember that Rhaegar Targaryen kept a Stark woman in a tower in the Dornish mountains, and that no grave was ever found for the child she was said to be carrying. Someone will count the years. Someone always does." Ned had no answer for that. He looked down at the boy, and then he looked at the mountains, and the shape of things began to arrange itself in his mind. They were in Dorne, the northernmost edge of Prince Doran Martell's domain. The pass ran south toward Kingsgrave, and from Kingsgrave the road continued to Sunspear, where the Prince of Dorne sat in his Tower of the Sun and thought long thoughts, and refused to move before he was ready. A patient man. A man who had held Dorne out of the rebellion and kept his silence while the world rearranged itself around him, and a man whose sister had been murdered in King's Landing 3 weeks ago, raped and killed by a Lannister blade, along with her 2 small children, Elia, who had been Rhaegar's first wife. the half-siblings. A man who had lost that much, and had still not moved, was either broken or was waiting. Ned had heard enough about Doran Martell to believe it was the latter. "Ride south," Ned said to Howland, "to Kingsgrave first. Find someone who can get a message to the prince. Tell him the Lord of Winterfell is here, in the pass, with something belonging to his house that he should see." Howland studied him for a long moment. "You'd trust him?" "I'd trust his grief," Ned said, "and his patience. They point toward the same enemy as mine." Doran Martell came 4 days later to a house of pale stone in the hills south of the tower, near enough to reach from the pass, far enough from any road to be private. He brought 6 riders and a guard captain who stood like a carved thing and said nothing. Doran walked with a careful, slightly measured step that Ned did not know yet to read, as the first sign of the gout that would take his knees in the years ahead. He was 35 years old. He had a face made for patience, broad, dark-eyed, still. He looked at Ned. He looked at the bundle in Ned's arms. He did not look away from either. Ned told him what mattered: the marriage, the witness, the parentage, the promise. He kept some particulars back. Trust, even the kind built from necessity, was built slowly, but he gave Doran enough. Doran was silent for a long time when he had finished. Then Rhaegar's son, true-born, his heir by law and blood, and by right of succession, the heir to the Iron Throne. The wind moved through the pass and offered no opinion. Robert Baratheon would kill him, Doran said, without hesitation, without a trial. Doran looked at the child, at the dark hair, at the stark face, at the grey eyes that carried no silver, no trace of the bloodline that had made half of him. A boy who looked like the North, like no one the South would look at twice. "My daughter is 7 years old," Doran said. "Her name is Arianne. She is my heir. Dawn passes without favor of sex, eldest child, regardless." A pause that held a great deal. "He will be a ward of Sunspear, given a Dornish name, raised at the Water Gardens with the other children. The world will not know what he is. Not yet." He looked at Ned directly. "When the time comes, Dawn will know first." Ned studied the man across the table, the patience in his face, the grief he had decided not to perform, the very deliberate way he held himself together. A man whose sister had been killed by the same world that would kill this child if it found him. "If anything happens to him, he is Rhaegar's son," Doran said. He said it quietly, without ornament, and Ned understood it was not a promise made to him. It was made to someone else, to Aelia perhaps, or to Rhaegar, or to the long list of absences that Doran Martell had been adding to since the sack. Ned handed the boy over. He did not allow himself to measure what it cost. He rode north, alone. The story he carried was simple. A bastard fathered in the south, a woman he would not name, a child who had not lived long enough to make the journey home. Catelyn would accept it. It would not be comfortable for either of them, but it would hold. Howland Reed rode east, back toward Greywater Watch, back to the neck and his reeds, and the silence he was good at keeping. He was the only other living soul who knew the full truth of what rested now in Doran Martell's arms. Ned had ordered the tower torn down before he left. There was no reason to leave it standing. The stones made cairns for the dead, and the dead had no objection. By the time anyone came looking, there would be nothing to find but rubble and the bones of the pass. He thought of Robert as he rode. Of a man who had made war on the world for love, and would never know, and must never know, that the woman he had loved had not needed saving. He thought of grey eyes going still, asterisk, Promise me, Ned. Asterisk. The King's Road was a long way north. He pointed his horse toward it and did not look back. The Water Gardens were the most beautiful place in Dorne that had not been built to defend anything. Pink marble terraces descended toward the sea in wide, shallow steps, and at every level there were pools, some deep enough to swim in, some no more than wide, flat dishes for the youngest children to splash their feet, and orange trees and the sound of water, going wherever water chose to go. The children who came here came from all over Dorne. That was the old custom. Lords' sons played alongside fishermen's daughters, alongside the children of stone castle knights and wandering merchants, and by the time they were old enough to understand the differences between them, they had already been pushing each other into the same pools for years. The point, Doran had always believed, was that Dorne's children should know the land before they learned to claim pieces of it. The point, in the summer of 285 AC, also happened to be that a 2-year-old boy with dark hair and grey eyes drew considerably less notice at the Water Gardens than he would have drawn anywhere else. Grey eyes were simply grey eyes. Jehan, the name Doran had chosen plain and Dornish and carrying nothing behind it, had recently mastered walking, which is to say, he had mastered the forward part and was still working on everything else. He moved between the fountain pools with the focused determination of someone who had discovered forward momentum and was not yet interested in its complications. His hair curled slightly when it was wet. It was usually wet because Arianne had decided she was responsible for his baths, along with most other things. She was 9 years old, dark-eyed and olive-skinned, and already carrying herself with an authority she had not entirely grown into yet. And she had been told that Jehan was a ward of House Martell, whose family had not survived the war, and that he was her particular responsibility. She had also been told with great seriousness that there was a betrothal to consider when they were older that had seemed very important at the time. It seemed somewhat less important now that she was watching him eat a handful of wet sand. Jehan, no, that is the ground. You are eating the ground. She retrieved him. He objected loudly. She carried him back to the fountain pool and set him in the shallows, and he was immediately satisfied because the water was cold and interesting and better than sand, and Jehan had not yet developed the stubbornness required to pretend otherwise. From the far terrace, Obara Sand watched with the expression she used when deciding whether something warranted her attention. She was 13 and already showing the lean fighter's build Oberyn had in full, broad-shouldered, unhurried, disinclined toward pools. Her father had brought her to the Water Gardens for reasons not shared with Arianne, which Arianne found predictably irritating. Obara watched things from the edges. "Your ward doesn't look Dornish," Obara said. "He's a ward," Arianne said. "He doesn't have to look Dornish." Obara's gaze moved from Arianne to the child in the pool. Jehan was attempting to catch his own reflection, staring down with those grey eyes, pale and steady, and not quite right for the south. Obara had her father's instinct for things that were not what they seemed. She could not yet name what bothered her about the boy, only that something did. "His eyes are grey," she said. "I'm aware," Arianne said. "I bathe him." Obara said nothing further, but she kept watching. In the shaded colonnade above the terrace, Prince Doran Martell sat in a high-backed chair and watched the children. Eriohota stood at his shoulder. The guard captain was Norvoshi born, and had carried the same long axe for longer than most of Doran's servants had been alive. He asked no questions that had not been invited. He had been Doran's shadow long enough to understand which ones those were. Doran watched Jehan in the pool. 2 years. The child had arrived as a thing that slept and cried and required constant tending, and had grown into a small, distinct person who walked unreliably and ate the ground and had over the past weeks developed a quality of attention in his grey eyes that Doran found difficult to name. The boy looked at things carefully. He looked at them again. He was 2 years old and already measuring the world without appearing to, and Doran recognized it because he had been doing the same thing his entire life. "He has his mother's look," Doran said. Hotar did not respond. He had not been asked a question. Doran's left foot ached in its soft boot. The physicians had warned him. He was ignoring the warning for as long as that remained possible. He shifted in the chair. Malaria was gone, back to Norvos, back to the city of her birth, with a grief Doran had not known how to reach, and had ultimately not been able to. Quentin had been sent to Ironwood before she left, and she had not forgiven him for it. And then she had stopped trying not to forgive him, and had simply gone. The water gardens were quieter without her. More of the loneliness in them was his. He watched Arianne carry the boy back from some new piece of mischief, and felt briefly something he could not quite call hope. The footsteps on the terrace stairs came quick and light, and then Oberyn was at the top of them, lean and dark, unhurried, in the way of a man who had always been fast enough not to need haste. He had been traveling again. He had the look of someone who had come a long way and found the distance unremarkable. "You didn't send word," Doran said. "I never send word. You know this." Oberyn's gaze had already moved past him to the children below, to Obara. Briefly, an approving nod, and then to the small, dark-haired boy in the pool. He was quiet for a moment. "That's the ward. That's the ward!" Oberyn watched Yehan with the careful attention he gave things he had not yet decided about. The boy looked nothing like the South. Nothing like Dawn. Nothing like any name Oberyn could reach for and be sure of. He let the silence sit for a moment without filling it, which was unlike him. And then he said, "He doesn't look Dornish." "No," Doran agreed. "He doesn't." Another silence. Oberyn looked at his brother, and Doran met the look, and gave nothing away, and Oberyn, for now, chose not to press. He would press later. He always did, eventually. "The girl's good with him," he said. "She is." The afternoon light went golden across the terraces. Below, Arianne had given up on the pool entirely, and was sitting on the fountain's edge with Jehan in her lap. And the child had gone still. The absolute sudden stillness of a toddler arriving at sleep without warning or ceremony. His head rested against Arianne's shoulder. His dark hair was damp. His grey eyes were closed. Arianne sat very straight and did not move, as though she understood that she was holding something that required steadiness and was determined to provide it, even at 9 years old, even without knowing what steadiness was really for. Ariohota watched from his place in the colonnade's shadow. He watched Oberyn watching the child. He watched Doran watching Oberyn. He watched Arianne sit without moving, both arms around the boy, with the solemn propriety of someone given a charge she could not yet fully read. He asked no questions. He simply watched and remembered, and stood between his lord and whatever the world had not yet sent. In 10 years, Jon had learned 3 things about Dawn that no one had needed to teach him directly. The first was heat, not the miserable kind, but heat as a fact of the world, reliable as stone and just as indifferent. The second was patience. He had learned it from watching Doran Martell, who could sit through an entire afternoon's audiences and say fewer words than most men use before mid-morning, and accomplish more with them. The third thing was the spear. That he had learned from Oberyn. Prince Oberyn Martell was nothing like his brother. He arrived at the water gardens in the 7th month of 293 AC, the way he arrived everywhere, without announcement, with the quick, light step of a man who moved faster than necessity required because he enjoyed the advantage it gave him. He had brought 3 of his daughters, Obara, who was 21, and looked at John the way a seasoned fighter looks at a practice opponent before deciding whether to bother. Nymeria, who was 18 and measured everything she looked at against some internal ledger, and Tyene, who was 16 and wore an expression so pleasant that John had already learned to watch her hands instead. He had come for an extended stay. He unpacked properly, claimed a room with southern exposure, and began appearing at the training yard before the light was fully up. John was 10 years old. He was faster than most boys his age had any right to be, and he had been sparring with practice weapons since he was 7. Oberyn watched him for 1 session without remark, and on the 2nd morning handed him a real spear, balanced, weighted for his height, and said, "From the beginning, what followed was not kind." Oberyn had no interest in John's existing habits, except as a list of things to correct. He rebuilt his footwork until John's legs ached from positions he had never been asked to hold. Had Obara demonstrate a proper guard while he circled and pointed out each flaw and set Tyene to sparring with him on the 3rd day without warning. She hit him twice in the ribs before he'd seen her set her feet. John did not complain. He went back to the position and tried it again. That was what Oberyn noticed and did not comment on directly. The boy's way of taking correction without flinching, of returning to the work as though humiliation had not occurred. It was not stubbornness, and it was not mere discipline. It was something he had built in himself, quietly, out of some interior arrangement that had nothing to do with lessons. As though he had decided at some point when he was very young that losing ground had consequences beyond bruises, and he had not revised the decision since. On the 12th day, Oberyn went to see Doran. The tower of the sun's upper chamber smelled of old parchment, and the incense Doran burned for the pain in his foot. Doran was in the lower chair, the practical one, not the carved throne, with his ankle resting on a cushioned stool. The gout had not been kind. He watched Oberyn close the door and sit without being invited, which was Oberyn's standard approach to rooms. "The boy," Oberyn said. "The ward," Doran said. "The ward." Oberyn leaned back and looked at the ceiling briefly, organizing his argument. "His eyes are grey. I have been watching him for 12 days, and his eyes remain grey. He corrects faster than any 10-year-old I have ever trained. He holds ground under pressure, like someone who understands that failing to hold it carries consequences beyond the yard." He looked at Doran. "He is no ward, brother." Doran said nothing. "He watches everything. He has been watching everything since he was old enough to do it, and no one has given him a reason to stop." Oberyn's voice stayed pleasant. "That was how you knew he was serious. Where did you find him?" The silence lasted long enough that Oberyn sat forward. Doran. "He was born in 283 AC, Doran said, "in a tower in the Red Mountains at the top of Prince's Pass. His mother was Lyanna Stark. They had married, quietly, in dawn, before a septon, before the gods, before the war ended, before the sack. He said the last word without inflection, which was the only way he could say it. The child is not a bastard. He is Rhaegar's true-born son, his heir, and by right of succession, the heir to the Iron Throne." Oberyn did not move. He sat with his hands still in his lap, and his dark eyes fixed on Doran's face, and did not speak for long enough that the incense smoke had time to curl and dissipate before he said anything at all. 10 years, he said. Yes, you have been sitting on this for 10 years, not quite an accusation, something colder that came from the same place. And you did not tell me. No. Oberyn breathed slowly through his nose. The stillness was the dangerous kind, not emptiness but everything drawn inward and compressed. Doran had seen it before and did not mistake it for calm. Halia, Oberyn said. Yes, Halia had nothing to do with this child. Nothing, Doran said. This child is the last of Rhaegar's blood. He carries nothing of what was done to her except the reason to answer it. He paused. I have been waiting to answer it for 10 years. I intend to wait until we can answer it properly. Oberyn was silent. Something moved in his face, not softening, because Oberyn's face did not soften, but a different quality of stillness. The moment when a thing that has been approaching for a long time arrives at its place. Who else knows, he said. No one in Dorne. A Crannogman named Howland Reed was at the tower when the child was born. Ned Stark brought him to me and rode north. Both of them have kept it. Doran looked at his brother steadily. You will also keep it. Not Hilaria. Not the girls. Not yet. I understand I need more than understanding, Oberyn. His brother met his eyes. Then not with ceremony. Oberyn never used ceremony for things he either meant or did not. He said, I will train him. The rest of it I will keep until you tell me to open it. On Elia's name, names like that held. Doran nodded once. Outside the window, the afternoon moved on without asking anyone's permission. The corridor outside the tower's upper chamber had a window looking down onto a small inner courtyard. And the courtyard's far wall had a door that was usually latched, but that afternoon was not. And Arianne Martell, who was 17 years old and had spent most of her life finding unlocked doors and making decisions about them, had been crossing through it with no particular destination when her father's voice came through the stone, flat and deliberate, the tone he used when he had decided a thing could no longer be kept. She stopped. She did not mean to listen. Then she meant to. She did not hear all of it. She heard enough. His mother was Lyanna Stark. His father was Rhaegar Targaryen. Her father's voice, naming the dead as plainly as he would name the weather. The child is not a bastard. He is Rhaegar's true-born son. She stayed until the voices went quiet. Then she walked carefully down the stairs and through the garden and back to the water gardens, where the fountains ran and the afternoon went on at its own pace, and nothing looked different from the outside. She sat by the fountain, where she used to hold Jehan when he was too young to hold himself up, when she was 9 and he was 2, and the most she knew was that her father had given her a responsibility, and she intended to honor it. She sat there now and looked at the water, and tried to understand what had just changed. Not merely the heir to Dorne. She had always been that, and had been building herself toward it since she was old enough to understand what it meant. Something larger than that, something that had been true for 10 years without her knowing it, something that rearranged every room she stood in by giving it a different ceiling. She was the betrothed of a boy who was not who he had been an hour ago. Not to her, not to the world. She now understood she had been living in without quite seeing its shape. Jehan was still at the training yard. She could hear the spear work from where she sat, if she listened, the rhythm of it, the pauses when Oberyn corrected something, the resumed sound when the correction had been taken. She thought about what she had heard. The heir to the Iron Throne. She sat by the fountain for a long time, listening to the spear, and did not go back inside. By 296 AC, Jon had stopped being the smallest person in the training yard, and Obara Sand had quietly adjusted the force behind her attacks to compensate. She would not have admitted this. She would have said she was correcting for his improvement, and she would have been mostly telling the truth. Jon was 13 and had grown into his height over the past year with the sudden determination of someone who had decided to get it over with. The result was a boy who was still lean and not yet finished, but who moved with a precision that made the extra effort necessary. Obara had been training since before he was born. She had not expected to need to work this hard. Nymeria watched from the yard's stone bench with the expression she kept for things she was still making up her mind about. She was 21, and where Obara's interest in fighting was instinctive and total, Nymeria's was calculating. She watched Jon the way you watch an argument being made, looking for the flaw in the reasoning. She had not found one yet, which was itself interesting. Tyene sat on the low wall, with her hands folded in her lap and her pleasant expression in place, which meant she was paying more attention than anyone else in the yard. Oberyn ran the session. He had been running Jon's sessions for 3 years, and the instruction had changed as Jon changed. Earlier it had been correction and repetition, the building of foundations. Now it was more like conversation. Oberyn set a problem and waited to see how Jon worked through it. And when Jon found a wrong answer, Oberyn let it stand long enough for Jon to discover it was wrong before intervening. This was a different kind of teaching. Jon had not yet realized it was deliberate. Again, Oberyn said. Jon reset to guard. Awara came forward, and he took her strike on the shaft of the practice spear and redirected it. Not enough force to unbalance her, but with the timing of someone who had made that calculation correctly. Obara pulled back and considered him for a moment. It was, from Obara, a concession. From the terrace above, Arianne watched. She was 20 years old and had come to the Water Gardens for the week from Sunspear's court, where she had been learning the administrative weight of airship at her father's measured pace. Below her, Jon moved through the drill without expression, the same focused composure he brought to everything, the quality she had watched him build in himself since before he could hold a practice spear properly. He thought he was training to be a worthy ward. He thought the gravity that lived behind his grey eyes was obligation. She could not tell him what it actually was. Not yet. Not until her father decided. She went inside before he looked up. That evening, Doran called her to his study. There was a document on the table beside him, folded, sealed the seal of a hand she didn't immediately place, and he waited until she was seated before he spoke. "There is something I have not told you," he said, "about why Viserys Targaryen believes he has a claim on you." He told her about Braavos. The pact had been arranged before Jon ever came to Sunspear. Doran had gone to Braavos in secret. Oberyn with him, Sir Willem Darry, representing the Targaryens in exile, the Sea Lord of Braavos as witness. The arrangement, Arianne would marry Viserys Targaryen, last known male heir of the Dragon Kings, and Dawn would bring its spears to the Targaryen restoration when circumstances allowed. The pact was signed, and then Ned Stark rode south from a tower in the Red Mountains, Doran said, and changed what was possible. Arianne sat with this. She had met Viserys once, briefly, when she was 12, a port visit, a formal dinner half an afternoon. Silver-haired and precisely made, the way the Targaryens always were. But something had curdled in him that she couldn't name at 12, and could now. Exile did things to people. "So, Jon was not the plan," she said. "Jon was better than the plan, she understood. Rhaegar's true-born son outranked his younger brother in every legal sense, a superior claim, a superior position, a superior peace. The Bravos Pact had been the best move available on the board that existed in 283 AC. 14 years later, the board had changed. She absorbed this without letting it settle, because if she let it settle, she would have to think about what it meant to have been arranged from birth as part of someone's long strategy. And she understood power well enough to know that this was not the question worth asking. The question worth asking was what to do with it. "He still believes the pact holds," she said. "He does, and he has been asking questions in Pentos about the ward at Sunspear." Doran's voice carried no anger. He had long since stopped confusing anger with usefulness. "Someone in the trading lanes was less careful than I required. Your answer to his questions has been silence, which is not a permanent answer." Oberyn arrived as the lamp oil was burning low, taking the chair across from Doran without invitation. He had heard the summary of Viserys' inquiries before coming in. Arianne could tell from the particular set of his mouth, which was the expression he wore when he had already done the calculation and did not like the result. "Silence toward Viserys has a natural limit," he said. "He is not a patient man. 3 years of exile without the thing he was promised, and now word reaching him of a ward in the Betrothed's place. He will not endure that indefinitely. And when he decides he will not endure it, the decision will not be careful. He has not spent his years in exile becoming careful." He looked at Doran. "If he makes noise in the wrong direction, among the wrong people, we will not be able to control what travels back to King's Landing." Doran was quiet for a long moment. "Continue to watch the Pentos channels when he moves." It was not a solution. Arianne filed this, that her father had acknowledged it without pretending otherwise, and that he had allowed her to hear him acknowledge it. She was being prepared for a role she had not yet been given. She could feel its outline from here. She found Jon at the water gardens at dusk, sitting on the low wall near the fountain where the orange trees grew thickest. He had a practice spear across his knees, not in use, just carried, the way a hand rests on something familiar without thinking about it. She sat beside him. For a while neither of them spoke. "What do you want?" she asked. She had not planned to say it. It came out before she had decided what to do with the answer. Jon considered. He always did. This took questions seriously, turned them over before speaking, as though they deserved the same effort as any other problem. At 13, with the day's work still visible in the set of his shoulders, he looked briefly like someone older and younger, at the same time. "To serve Dorne well," he said. He said it the way he said everything he meant plainly, without the performance that other people added to sincerity. He had never learned to soften what he meant. It had never occurred to him that softening it might be useful. She looked at him for a long time. The fountain ran. The last of the day's light moved through the orange trees, going amber and then gone. In Doran's study, window above the garden wall, a lamp came on. She watched it for a moment and then looked away. She did not tell him. She did not say, "There is a ceiling above everything you think you know, and it is higher than you can see from here." She did not say, "The simplicity with which you want things is something you are going to lose. And you should remember what it felt like, because it will not come back in the same shape." She said, "You already are." He looked at her with those grey eyes, Lyanna Stark's eyes, though he would never know to call them that, not for another year. The look was direct and trusting in the way of someone who had not yet been given a reason not to trust. She looked back at him and thought about what was coming. The fountain ran on. She did not move until the dark made it impossible to pretend she could stay. The letter came on a trading ship out of Pentos, routed through 3 hands before it reached the Shadow City, and it was not subtle. Doran read it twice, once for content, once for tone, and then set it on the table in the Tower of the Sun and looked at it the way he looked at anything that required patience, as though it had not yet decided how much of a problem it intended to be. The content, Viseries of House Targaryen, third of his name, King of the Andals and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm. He used every title, all of them. Why a ward of unknown origin occupied the place in Doran Martell's future that he had been promised, and what Dorn intended to do about it. He threatened, between the formal clauses, to bring Dorn's treachery before every associate power that might find it useful. He signed with a flourish. The ink had pressed hard into the parchment, the pressure of a man angrier than his words. Admitted that tone was the interesting part. Viserys had written this letter the way a man writes when he has decided he has nothing to lose, which was precisely the thing Oberyn had warned about and Doran had hoped to avoid. A little longer, he sent for Oberyn. The three of them sat in the Tower of the Sun, with Aeryo Hotter at the door and the letter on the table between them, and none of them agreed. Doran wanted a diplomatic non-answer, something that acknowledged receipt without conceding anything, that bought another year of ambiguity. Oberyn argued for the opposite. Invite Viserys to Sunspear. Let him come and let the boy's existence answer the question of precedence without Doran needing to say a word. Arianne wanted to go to Essos herself, Pentos, or wherever Viserys was, to assess the man directly before any answer was sent. None of these positions was entirely wrong, none of them was yet possible. The silence after the argument ran out was the silence of people who understood that the real problem was not the letter, but what the letter signaled. Something had shifted in Viserys's calculus. A man no longer willing to be patient was a man who might do something that brought unwanted attention to Sunspear, to the ward who had lived there for 14 years, to a secret that would not survive that kind of light. It was Doran who said it. I am going to tell the boy. Oberyn looked at him. Arianne went still. Not because it is time, Doran said, because it is no longer safe. Not to, if Viserys speaks in the wrong place, someone may come looking. Jon must understand what he is, and why everything depends on him remaining what he has always appeared to be. He looked at Arianne. Say nothing to him before I do. He called Jon to the Tower of the Sun the next morning. Jon came the way. He always came to Doran's summons, promptly, without hurrying, which was a distinction Doran had always quietly noted. He was 14 years old and stood with the self-contained stillness of someone who had learned early that the way you entered a room told people something before you had said a word. Dark-haired and grey-eyed, lean in the way of someone still assembling himself, he looked at Doran with the careful attention of a ward who had never been entirely certain of his position. Doran waited until Jon had sat. Your father's name was Rhaegar Targaryen, he said. He said it without preface, because he had decided that was the only way to say it. He watched Jon's face. Your mother's name was Lyanna Stark. They were married in secret, in Dorne, before a septon, before the gods, before the war that killed them both. Their marriage was real and witnessed. You are their true-born son, not a bastard, not a ward. You are Aegon Targaryen, sixth of his name, the rightful heir to the Iron Throne by blood and law. He paused. And if Robert Baratheon ever learns that you are alive, he will kill you without hesitation and without regret. He did not speak immediately. He sat with what he had been given the way he sat with any other problem, as though it required full attention before anything could be said. Then, does Arianne know? Doran held his gaze. Yes, For how long? A beat. 4 years. Jon was quiet. The quiet was not blankness. Doran could see it was the opposite of blankness, a stillness that contained a great deal of activity, but it offered nothing outward. It was the most careful thing in the room. "Is there anything you want to ask me?" Doran said. Jon thought for a moment. "Not yet," he said, and he was silent again, and the silence held. He found Arianne at the water gardens in the early afternoon. She was at the largest fountain. She had come here, instead of staying inside, though she could not have explained the logic, except that this was where she had held him when he was small, where she had sat with the weight of what she knew and tried to understand what she had become. She looked up when she heard him coming, and she did not look away. Jon stopped a few feet from her. He did not shout. He looked at her the way he looked at things that mattered. "Why didn't you tell me?" "It wasn't mine to tell," she said. "My father forbade it. And—" She stopped, then made herself continue. "I tried to treat you as Jon, not as a claim, not as a strategy. I tried to know who you actually were, separate from what you were supposed to be. Did it work sometimes?" He sat down on the fountain's edge across from her. The water moved between them, pale and indifferent. "Would you have chosen me?" he asked, "if you'd been given a choice? Not arranged, not assigned. If someone had asked you." She looked at him. 14 years old, dark-haired and still, with his entire understanding of his life, replaced an hour ago by something larger and heavier, and asking her not about thrones, but about whether she knew what she felt. "I don't know yet," she said. It was the truest answer she could have given, and they both felt it. Something in the air between them shifted. The careful asymmetry of 4 years of unequal knowledge, the quiet distance of a secret held on one side of a conversation, and not the other. It did not disappear, but it changed shape. They were on the same ground now for the first time in either of their memories. "That's honest," Jon said. "Yes." They sat by the fountain for a while, and the afternoon moved around them, and neither of them tried to fill the silence with something easier. That evening, Oberyn came to Jon's room. He was carrying a spear. Not a practice weapon, not the balanced training poles Jon had used for 3 years. A real weapon. The shaft was dark and smooth, the head fitted with care, and it was sized for Jon's exact height. Oberyn held it out without ceremony. Jon took it. "You are going to need it," Oberyn said. He was already turning to leave. At the door he paused, not turning back. And not for the sand snakes. He was not a man who explained things that could be understood without words. Jon stood in his room with the spear in his hands. He turned it once, feeling the balance. He understood. Outside the window, the water garden's fountains ran in the dark the same as they ran in daylight, indifferent to what the day had changed. He stood there for a long time holding the spear, and let the weight of the name he had been given settle where it was going to settle. Not a ward's name, not a Dornish name. The name his mother had given him before she died, in a tower in the Red Mountains, while the war that had killed his father was already finishing without her. He did not know yet what to do with it. He knew that he would have to find out. Viserys Targaryen came to Sunspear in the 7th month of 297 AC, which was not the season for it, and not the invitation he'd been given, and these things were true in ways that were also true of Viserys himself. He arrived by ship at the Shadow City docks, with 6 retainers, and the manner of a man arriving at a place he owns. Areo-Hotah met him at the threefold gate, the outermost of Sunspear's 3 successive gates, where the Shadow City gave way to Sunspear's wolves, with a courtesy so cold it could have served as a weapon. He escorted the Prince of Nothing and everywhere to the old palace, which was the ancient Martell seat and comfortable and not the Tower of the Sun. The difference was architectural. It was also political, Viserys noticed. He was 21 years old, and he had the Targaryen look in full. Silver pale hair, the particular bone structure that kept emerging from Valyrian blood regardless of how many generations removed, eyes of pale lilac that had seen too little power and too much slight. He was handsome in the abstract way of a man, whose beauty had always been pointed out to him, and who had come to treat it as evidence of his right to things. He was also, Arianne had noted, and filed away and said nothing about, watching everything with those light eyes. Doran received him in the Tower of the Sun that afternoon. The formal throne room at Doran's choice, which meant Viserys arrived as a petitioner, regardless of how he'd walked in. He came in speaking, which was itself a piece of data. He had prepared his opening and intended to use it before Doran could establish the terms. The Bravos Pact. Arianne, the ward. He wanted names and explanations and the fulfillment of a promise made before gods and the Sea Lord of Bravos as witness. He said all of it with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed it over a long sea crossing and wanted to demonstrate that he had. Doran let him finish. Then, you are welcome in Sunspear, as all guests. You must be tired from your journey, and nothing more. The non-answer of a man who had been practicing patience since before Viserys was old enough to understand what patience was for. He sent Arianne. She went the next morning, dressed for a social call, and she was, in the way that mattered, Doran's sharpest instrument for this occasion. She was 21, dark-eyed, and full of the quality Dorne bred into its women, a surface that gave warmth while gathering information, the kind of presence that made men feel understood without quite realizing they were being read. She went to the old palace's sitting room and spent an hour with Viserys across a table set with fruit and wine. What she saw, a man who had been told since birth that the world owed him something, and who had spent 2 decades watching the owing go unrequited. Handsome, yes, the Targaryen line produced that, with the consistency of something deliberate silver hair and fine features, the ghost of something that might in a different life have resembled Rhaegar. But Rhaegar, from everything she had been told, was melancholy and interior. Viserys was something louder and sharper. The beauty was real. What lived behind it was not. She gave him warmth. She gave him the impression that she found him interesting. She gave him nothing that could be carried away and used. He asked about the ward. She said the ward was a child, kept at the water gardens as an old custom, nothing of consequence. He watched her say it with those pale eyes, and she could feel him deciding whether to believe her, and she returned his gaze with complete serenity, and he moved on to other subjects. She reported to Doran afterward he did not believe her. He was not certain she was lying, but he did not believe her. He had come to Sunspear looking for something specific, and had not found it yet. Then we must hope he does not find it, Doran said. He was already writing in the margin of a document. He did not look up. He found it that afternoon. Arianne was walking Viserys through the water gardens. One of the things guests were always shown, the pink marble terraces and the pools, and the orange trees consumed time without revealing anything. They were coming from the practice yard. Jon carried the spear Oberyn had given him, and moved with the particular ease of someone trained by a man who made ease into an art form. He was 14 years old, and he crossed the courtyard without looking at anyone. Viserys stopped. He looked at the boy, the dark hair, the grey eyes, the unhurried stride, and something moved in his face that Arianne could not entirely read and did not like. She said, before he could speak, one of the ward's companions, "The prince keeps several boys for the yard. His name, Viziris-ed-Jahan, a common name. He does not look Dornish. Children come from all over Dorne to the water gardens. It is an old custom. Children of all stations play together, regardless of where they're from." Viserys watched Jon cross to the far gate until he was gone. Then he looked at Arianne in a way that suggested she had confirmed something he had already suspected, and she looked back at him with the perfect surface, and they stood there in the orange tree light with a secret between them he could almost touch but not quite name. He went to Doran that evening. He was done performing patience. He sat across from Doran in the Tower of the Sun and laid it out plainly. The boy had northern blood in his face. The war was 15 years past. Everyone knew Rhaegar Targaryen had kept a Stark woman in a tower in the Red Mountains. Everyone knew the child she'd been carrying had died. He stopped speaking. He looked at Doran. "Did it?" Doran looked back at him. Nothing moved in his face. Not calculation, not alarm, nothing that would have told a watching man that anything of consequence was happening in the space behind his eyes. "The child died at the tower," Doran said. "I know this because the man I sent to clear the site reported it to me personally, and the rubble is still in the pass if you care to ride north and look at it." A pause. Measured. "The ward you saw is the bastard son of a Dornish knight who fell at the Trident. He has been at the water gardens since he was small." Another pause. The final one, the one that closed the door. "If you came to Sunspear looking for ghosts, Your Grace, you will find only the sun and the sea." Viserys was quiet for a long moment. He could not read Doran's face. He was not certain he was being lied to. He was not certain he was being told the truth. He was left, as Doran had intended, in a place where certainty was unavailable and action was therefore impossible. Oberyn visited him that night. What passed between them in the old palace was not witnessed and not repeated. Oberyn spoke privately and quietly, which was never a sign that what he was saying was mild. The outcome was plain. Viserys left Sunspear the next morning before the second hour with his retainers and his unsatisfied suspicions and a physical understanding which Oberyn had a particular talent for producing. That Dorne's hospitality had a limit, and he had been shown exactly where it was. He was not satisfied. He was afraid. Both things lived in him as he sailed north for Pentos, and neither resolved the other, and he carried them together across the narrow sea with no way to put them down. Jon found Arianne near the fountains that evening. He asked, without preamble, what Viserys had wanted. "His birthright," she said. Jon was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the water rather than at her, which was the way he looked at things he was working through before he put them into words. "His birthright," he said. "Or mine." She looked at him. He was 14, dark-haired and grey-eyed, and standing at the edge of an understanding he had just reached, that his existence was not only Robert Baratheon's problem, that the claim he carried was a problem for every person who believed themselves to be the last Targaryen with a right to the throne. That Viserys Targaryen, who had spent his whole life as the heir to something that had been taken from him, was now the heir to something that had never actually been his to begin with, and that Jon's existence was the proof of it. She did not answer his question. She did not need to. He looked at her for another moment, and then he looked back at the water, and she watched him add this new thing to the structure of what he knew, filing it where it fit, making room, adjusting the weight. He was learning to think the way her father thought. The patience, the long view, the willingness to hold a piece of information until the moment it was useful. She was not sure yet whether that was the best possible outcome or the most dangerous one. The fountain ran. Neither of them spoke. Above the garden wall, Doran's lamp burned in the Tower of the Sun, and the night came in from the sea, and Sunspear went quiet in the way of a place that had just survived something and knew there was more to come. In 298 AC, the water gardens were quieter than Jon had ever known them. The summer children were gone, sent home before the cooler months, and the pools sat low and still under a sky that had gone from white to grey without committing to either. The orange trees kept their colour. Almost everything else had changed. Jon was 15 and had stopped measuring himself against what he had been. That was the year's most useful development. The stopping. He trained in the mornings with Oberyn when Oberyn was present, and with Oberyn when he was not, and in the afternoons he read from Doran's library. Not just Dornish lore and history, which he had been given since he was 11, but the history of the Targaryens. Doran had begun placing volumes on the study table and leaving the room without comment, which Jon understood was a form of instruction. He read, carefully taking in the dynasty from Aegon the Conqueror forward, the reigns and the wars and the particular quality of madness that surfaced every few generations, like something in the blood that could be managed but not removed. He had begun to understand what it would mean to claim what was his. He did not yet want it. The wanting, Doran had told him once, comes when you are ready for it too, and not before. Jon was working on ready. Arianne came to the water gardens for the 7th moon, as she did most years when the court season allowed. She was 22, and the gardens were a different place for her than they had been when she was 9, and responsible for a toddler who ate sand. She came back to them the way you come back to a place that shaped you, not to revisit, but to check whether you are still the person who was shaped there. She and Jon had found over the past year a way of being around each other that neither of them had quite named. It was not the careful distance of the years when she knew what he didn't. It was not the rawness of the first weeks after Doran's revelation. It was something that had been built from both of those things and become its own structure. Two people who knew too much about each other to pretend, who had been each other's secret keepers by different mechanisms and for different lengths of time, and who had decided without discussing it that honesty was the only ground they could both stand on. She asked him about the Targaryen histories. He told her what he found, what surprised him, what disturbed him. She listened and added things from her own reading, from her father's conversations with her. They were not doing the same thing, they were doing adjacent things, and the adjacency was becoming its own form of partnership. Tyene Sand was at the gardens as well. She had come south from a journey with Oberyn, and stayed when he moved on, which was not unusual. She and Jon had a friendship that had grown sideways from the years of sparring sessions, something quieter and stranger than his relationship with Oberyn. Oberyn respected his improvement, and showed it by hitting him harder. Tyene found him interesting and showed it by asking him questions she did not need answered. They were sitting near the smaller fountain when she said it. Jon had been working through something in his head. She could usually tell when he was doing this. Some inward arrangement of pieces that did not show on his face except as stillness, and she had been watching him with the expression she wore when she found something simultaneously amusing and worth addressing. "You think too much about what you are," she said, "and not enough about what you can do." Jon looked at her. "They're connected." "They're not. What you are is a fact. What you can do is a decision. Facts don't move. Decisions do." She adjusted the lacing on her boot with complete calm, as though the observation required no particular weight. "You spend most of your time sitting with the fact. It was not wisdom exactly. but it landed in the way that things land when they are true. And you have not found the words for them yourself. The news from the north came in the 10th month. A Dornish raven, routed carefully through several hands, reported that King Robert Baratheon had named Eddard Stark his Hand of the King. The Lord of Winterfell was riding south to King's Landing. Doran received the dispatch in his chair in the Tower of the Sun, his right foot wrapped and elevated. The gout having entered a phase, the maester was watching with concern. He read it once and set it aside. It was quiet for a time. Then he sent for Jon. "The man who brought you to Dorne was Eddard Stark," Doran said when Jon was seated. "You know this. What I have not told you is that for 15 years, Lord Stark has held the secret on one side of the realm, while I have held it on the other. He has been at Winterfell. His distance from King's Landing was itself a form of protection. A man far from court is a man who cannot be pressed by the wrong people at the wrong moment." He paused. "He is now riding south to serve the man who would kill you." Jon sat with this. Is he still keeping the secret? He has kept it for 15 years. He will keep it now, but every day he serves Robert is a day the secret is closer to the surface. Ned Stark at King's Landing is a different risk than Ned Stark at Winterfell. Doran's voice was even precise. "I am telling you this so that you understand the world is not static. It moves beneath us while we think we are standing on solid ground." Jon nodded. He did not ask what they could do about it. He had learned by now that Doran would tell him what was possible when something was possible. And that asking before then produced only the same answer with more words around it. Oberyn's letter arrived the following week. It was brief, which was how Oberyn wrote when the information was enough, without elaboration. Asterisk Viserys has found a Dothraki cow. The pact is about to become irrelevant. Be ready. Asterisk Doran read it and said nothing that evening. The next morning he called Arianne. She came and sat across from him and looked at her father in the morning light, the patience more visible on his face than it had been when she was young, the gout having done something to the lines of him that years alone had not a compression of what was already there. He handed her Oberyn's letter without preface. She read it. She set it on the table between them. "When will it begin?" she asked. "When Robert falls," Doran said. She looked at him steadily. "And if Robert does not fall?" He held her gaze for a moment, long enough that she understood he had already sat with this question, had turned it over, had made his peace with the uncertainty, and decided to remain in his position regardless. "Everything falls, Arianne," he said. "The only question is whether we are standing when it does." She did not argue. There was nothing to argue with. She picked up the letter, folded it along its original crease, and set it back in front of him. And she stayed in her chair and looked at her father, while the morning came in through the high windows of the Tower of the Sun. The water gardens outside were very quiet. The pools ran clear, and the orange trees held their color against the gray sky. And down by the smaller fountain, Jon was working through his morning forms alone. She could hear the spear work from the window, the rhythm of it, the pauses, the resumed motion. He had been at it since before first light. She listened to it for a moment and thought about standing, and what it would cost, and whether they were ready. She did not know yet. But the sound of the spear in the cool morning air was, she decided, a reasonable answer to a question no one had asked aloud. The raven came at mid-morning, routed through 2 castellans and a maester in Kingsgrave before it reached Sunspear, and by the time it arrived the news it carried was 3 days old. Ariohota brought it to Doran himself. He always carried sensitive dispatches personally, no intermediary, no extra hands, because the number of people through whom information passed was the number of places it could be lost. He gave the letter to Doran and stood at his shoulder and watched his lord read it. Doran's face did not change. That was how you knew it was serious. He read it twice, folded it along its crease, and set it on the arm of his chair. He looked at the window and the sea beyond it. Hota stood and said nothing, and waited. "Send for Jon and Arianne," Doran said. Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, Hand of the King, had been arrested for treason by the crown. Doran told them plainly, the way he always delivered difficult news, without cushioning, without apology, as though plainness was itself a form of respect. Jon sat with it and felt it settle strangely. Arianne was across the table from him, watching his face. "There are 2 people living in Westeros who know the truth of your birth," Doran said. "Ned Stark is one. Howland Reed, Lord of Greywater Watch, is the other. And Greywater Watch is inaccessible in ways that protect him from being pressed. Lord Stark is not so fortunately situated. He is in King's Landing, in Lannister custody, and the Lannisters are not particular about the methods they use to extract what they want to know." Jon said, "Can we help him?" Doran looked at him. "Not yet. Not without revealing everything we have. Spend 15 years concealing. If we move openly for Ned Stark, we tell the Crown that Dorne has a stake in his survival. And from there the questions that follow could unravel what cannot be unraveled." He paused. Lord Stark understood this when he rode south. He has understood it for 15 years. I have to believe he made that choice, knowing its weight. Jon was quiet. He had never met Ned Stark. He knew the man only as a shape in Doran's account, the lord who had carried a newborn from a dying woman's arms in a tower in the Red Mountains and ridden south to give that child a life instead of a grave. Knowing something as a story was different from knowing it as a debt. He was learning, that morning, that they were not the same thing. The Dornish merchant arrived at the Shadow City 3 days later, a small man with a legitimate cargo manifest and a second letter sewn into the lining of his coat, written in a cipher that Doran recognized from its first character. He took it into his study alone and read it. He locked it in the drawer. Then he came out and told Arianne what it said. The letter was from Varys. The Master of Whisperers had served 3 kings from the small council chamber in the Red Keep and maintained informants across every city in the known world, including, it appeared, Sunspear. He had known about the ward at the Water Gardens for some years, the letter implied, and had chosen silence, not to protect Doran, but because the same calculation that kept Doran quiet had kept Varys quiet. The secret was worth more intact than exposed. He was writing now because circumstances were shifting and the boy needed to be ready. Asterisk, the boy you keep must be ready. The wheel is turning. Asterisk, that was all. Doran sent a reply through the same channel. What does the Master of Whisperers want in return? The answer came back within the week, swiftly enough to confirm that Varys had been waiting for it. Nothing yet. Only confirmation that the boy lived and was prepared. When the time came, there would be more to say. Arianne asked her father what he made of it. "A man who collects secrets is offering his goodwill," Doran said. "I am gratified. I do not trust it. Goodwill that costs nothing up front is not goodwill. It is positioning." He set the reply beside the first letter and considered them together. "We acknowledge him, we prepare. We do not extend ourselves in his direction until we understand what he is building and who else is in the architecture." Oberyn arrived at Sunspear 10 days later, by sea rather than road, and the expression he carried into the Tower of the Sun was the one he wore when news was several things at once. Not good, not bad, but large. He had demanded a crown from the Dothraki carl he had attached himself to, and received one, molten gold poured over his head by Khal Drogo's own hands in front of witnesses in the Dothraki Sea. The man who had signed his letters as King of the Andals and the First Men had died of his crown. The Bravo's marriage pact, already void in practice, was now void in every other sense. There was no Viserys to honor it, invoke it, threaten with it, or be managed through it. Jon was the only Targaryen restoration plan remaining in the world. Doran absorbed this without comment. Oberyn stood in the center of the room and waited. Arianne sat with her hands still in her lap. It was Jon who spoke, after a moment. He had been sitting at the table while the news arranged itself around him, and when he said it quietly, with the specific inward quality of someone working out a category for the first time. He was my uncle, Rhaegar's younger brother, his father's brother. A man he had seen once at a distance in a water garden's courtyard, silver-haired and watching, and never spoken to. A man who had suspected him and feared him, and been his enemy without ever knowing the name of what he feared. None of them said anything in response. There was nothing useful to add. That evening Jon went to the water gardens and sat by the fountain for a while in the cooling air. Then he went inside. No one mentioned Viserys again that night. The second raven came 4 days later. Beheaded on the steps of the great Sept of Baelor on the order of King Joffrey by the headsman Ilyn Payne, with Ned Stark's own Valyrian steel greatsword turned against its master, the North would hear of it within the fortnight. The realm would feel it longer, Doran told Jon himself. He sat in his chair and said it plainly, the way he had said everything else. Jon sat across from him and listened. He did not weep. His face did the thing it did when he was containing something too large for immediate use, the particular stillness that was not blankness, a control that was spending something you could not see being spent. He sat for a long moment. Then he said, "Thank you for telling me yourself." He stood, he walked out, he went to the training yard. He worked the spear through every form Oberyn had taught him, from the first footwork corrections of 10 years ago through the combinations he had built in the past year, until he could do them without thinking, and when the forms ran out, he made new ones and worked those too, and when his arms gave out, he stopped and sat on the yard's stone floor with the spear across his knees and let the night be around him. The sound of the water garden's fountains came over the wall, steady as it had always been, indifferent to what the day had taken. Arya Hota stood at the yard's entrance and watched. He had been standing at the edge of Lord's grief for longer than Jon had been alive, and he understood the practice. Be present, make no sound, ask nothing. Let the person in the yard find their way back to themselves without making them aware they are being watched over. Hota watched him work and said nothing and stood there until Jon was done. The news of Robb Stark's crown came by Raven 2 weeks after the North rose. It found Doran in the Tower of the Sun and Jon in the training yard, and Doran sent for Jon himself, rather than letting him hear it second-hand, which was its own communication. Robb Stark, Lord of Winterfell, had been declared king in the North, and of the Trident by the lords who had followed him south to war. He was 16 years old. He had marched on King's Landing to free his father, and arrived to find his father already dead, and he had turned his army's grief into a crown rather than let it become despair. The lords of the North and the Riverlands had knelt and called him king, and the boy born at Winterfell in the same year, Jon had been born in a tower in the Red Mountains, was now a king, in fact, as well as name. Jon sat in a chair across from Doran for a long moment without speaking. His half-brother, in the only way that mattered. The son Ned Stark had raised openly, legally as his heir, the boy who had grown up with Ned's name and Ned's house and Ned's protection and had turned around to find his father murdered and his inheritance under siege and had done something about it. "He's fighting the Lannisters who hold the throne," Jon said. "Yes, Robert is dead. It is Cersei Lannister who holds the crown in Joffrey's name. Robb is the first to move against them directly." Doran said it without inflection. He was watching Jon think. Jon let it connect to the other things he knew. Then he said, "I want to go north." Doran said nothing, not openly. Disguised, a trader's son, a camp follower. Whatever cover gets me to Robb's camp in the Riverlands, he needs to know I exist. A Targaryen restoration with northern support is something no Dornish declaration can replicate alone. The lords who followed Robb followed a Stark, and a Stark's endorsement carries weight that Dorne cannot manufacture on its own. He was thinking while he spoke, reasoning in the open rather than performing an argument. "Let me go to him." Doran was quiet for a moment that held a great deal. "Then, tell me why it fails." Jon looked at him. "You have made the case for going. Make the case against. If it holds, I will weigh them together." He did it anyway, because he had learned that Doran's exercises were never arbitrary. He started with what he could see. Robb was 16 and fighting on multiple fronts. The lords who had crowned him had crowned a Stark, Ned's son, Winterfell's heir, everything they knew and trusted. The moment Jon appeared at Robb's camp claiming to be Rhaegar Targaryen's son, those lords had a question they had not had before. Whose king had they been following? The answer they had given, Ned Stark's heir, carrying their grievance south to answer Joffrey's injustice, became something different and complicated the moment a Targaryen claimant was in the same room. "It fractures the coalition," Jon said. "Before it can win a single battle," Doran said. Yes, it was not dismissal. That was the difficult part. Doran took the argument seriously and then explained precisely why it failed, and the seriousness was more deflating than dismissal would have been. Jon sat with it. Oberyn arrived late from the courtyard, where he had been working Nymeria through drills. He pulled out a chair without ceremony and dropped into it. He had heard enough from the doorway to have the shape of things. "The North is still the right instinct," he said to Jon. "You've identified the right resource. You've chosen the wrong Northerner." Jon looked at him. "Robb Stark is a king with a war to win. He cannot afford to be the man who vouched for Rhaegar's son. Not while he is still holding his coalition together, not while every lord in his camp is watching every decision he makes for signs of weakness or confusion." Oberyn leaned forward, elbows on his knees, with the focused energy of a man who had already worked through this. But Howland Reed is a different matter entirely. The Cranagman who is at the Tower of Joy. Who was in the room when your mother died? Who watched Ned Stark carry you out of that tower and ride south to place you in Doran's arms? If you want proof that can be brought before the realm without Dorne's word standing alone, Howland Reed is that proof. He is the only other living person who was there. Greywater Watch is inaccessible, Doran said, by design. The Cranagmen do not invite approach. A message can be sent without approach. Whether it is answered is a separate question. Arianne came in the evening, after the argument had completed its first round, and settled into something quieter. She had been at the edge of the day's councils without being inside them, the way she sometimes managed, present enough to know the shape of things, absent enough to have thought about them without the room's pressure. She sat across from Jon and looked at him, the way she did when she had been waiting to say something. "I have been waiting since I was 17, she said. "Since I stood in a corridor and heard your father's name through stone. She was 23 now, and the years of knowing had shaped her the way sustained effort shapes something. Not broken, not embittered, but different from what it had been before the weight was placed on it. Patience is not weakness. I know this and I believe it. But it has a cost that is real, and I want you to know it clearly, not because I am arguing for recklessness, but because you should see it with open eyes. Jon waited. Every year that passes, the Stark children grow up without knowing you exist. Every year the North builds its grief into something that does not include you. Every year, the realm forgets that Rhaegar Targaryen had a son, because the realm was told the son died, and the living forget what they were told. Faster than they think they will. She held his gaze steadily, without softening it. I am not telling you to go north. I am telling you what it costs to stay. The room was quiet when she finished. Jon looked at his hands. At the calluses that 15 years of spear work had built there, the small scars from sessions that had gone further than intended. He had a Dornish name and a Dornish education, and a Dornish betrothed, and a Dornish spear, and a father's name that would overturn every room he walked into the moment it was spoken aloud. He had a half-brother who was 16 years old and already a king, who had taken his father's death and built a crown from it, who had no idea that the boy raised at Sunspear was anything more than a ward. "What do you propose?" he said to Doran. "You do not go north," Doran said, "but I send a message to Greywater Watch through the most indirect route available, which will take time. Asking Lord Reed to come south, or to send proof south that can stand independent of Dorn's word." He held Jon's gaze. "This is not action. It is preparation for action. There is a difference, and the difference matters, because an action taken before the preparation is complete is not action, it is expenditure." Jon looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. It was not a satisfied nod. Doran had not expected it to be. He went to the Tower of the Sun's upper floor that night, the room above Doran's study, where a window faced north and the sea was visible in both directions if you stood close enough to the glass. He stood at it for a long time. He was 16. He had been 16 for months, moving through the year, with the sense of standing at an edge, without being able to see how far the drop went. Below the window, the Shadow City showed its lights in the dark, and beyond it, the sea moved toward a horizon that had Westeros somewhere on the other side. He was Aegon Targaryen, and he had been told this for 2 years, and had learned to carry the name the way you carry something too large for a single grip, distributed across everything, adjusted constantly, never quite set down. What he had not yet found was what the name meant in his body. In the moment when something needed to be done, and he was the one who needed to decide to do it. Not in a tower, not in a room with Doran and a problem to work through. In the actual world, against an actual enemy, with everything real and in motion around him. He stood at the window and thought about Robb Stark, who was 16, and had already answered that question. The night was warm. The sea moved where it wanted. The Shadow City went gradually quiet below him, light by light. He was going to find out, one way or another, and soon he could feel it the way you feel weather coming before the sky has committed to it. He stayed at the window until most of the lights had gone out. Then he went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to the fountains run in the water gardens below, the same as they had always run, the same as they would run tomorrow. He was not the same as he had been yesterday. He was beginning to understand that this was the point. The ship came into Sunspear's harbour in the second month of 300 AC, a white harbour grain trader, unremarkable by any visible measure. Its cargo was legitimate. Its captain was a large, quiet man who asked no questions of the harbor officials and answered their questions without elaborating. Among the passengers listed in the manifest was a small, dark-complexioned merchant from the north, traveling south, for reasons the manifest described as personal commerce. Howland Reed had not been south of the Neck in 17 years. Arianne met him at the harbor with 2 men and a closed cart, which was not the greeting of Sunspear's standard hospitality and which Howland accepted without comment. He had the unhurried quality of a man accustomed to places that required patience for different reasons than the ones governing life at Sunspear. The patience of terrain that did not accommodate speed and did not apologize for it. He was small and dark and plainly dressed, and he looked, Hota thought, like a man who had decided a long time ago that what he looked like did not matter as much as what he saw. Doran received him in the Tower of the Sun's private room, not the throne room, not the study, but the room between them, that had no formal name and was used for conversations requiring privacy without the formality of an audience. He was in his chair with his foot elevated, and he looked at Howland Reed across 17 years of parallel silence and saw a man who had kept the same secret from the opposite side of the realm and was still standing. "Lord Reed," he said, "Prince Doran." Howland sat in the offered chair without ceremony. "You said in your message that the boy was ready. I said he might be. I wanted you to see him yourself before we decided what he was ready for." Howland studied him for a moment. "You want me to decide how much to tell him?" "I want you to look at him first. What you decide to tell him afterward is yours to determine. He has heard my account, and Oberyn's. He has not heard from anyone who was in that room." Howland was quiet. How much does he know? Everything except what it felt like to be there. That was the right answer, apparently, because Howland nodded once and said nothing more on the subject. John came in when Doran sent for him. He was 17, tall for his age, dark-haired, with the grey eyes that were the Stark family's most consistent inheritance across generations. He entered the way he entered every room that mattered, deliberately, without haste, taking in who was present before committing to a position. He looked at Howland Reed. Howland looked at him. Howland's face did the thing faces do when they are seeing something expected and finding it more real than expected. He looked at John steadily, not cataloguing, the way you look at a person rather than a fact. Then you have her eyes, the color, not the shape. The shape is Rhaegar's. John went still, not in the way of someone managing a reaction, in the way of someone for whom a piece of the world has just settled into a place they did not know was empty. No one had ever said that to him before. They had told him he was Rhaegar's son. They had told him Lyanna's name. They had given him the facts of his existence, with the care of people who understood those facts, were enormous, and none of it had included the specific quality of his mother's eyes, described by a man who had been in the room with her when she was alive. He was his mother's eyes and his father's face, and a person, not only a claim. Arianne, sitting to the side of the room where she had positioned herself quietly before John arrived, saw what happened to his face when Howland said it, and understood something she had not expected to understand. She had not known everything. She had known the facts. She had known what John was. She had not known how little that was. Howland told it from the beginning. Not from Doran's account, not from the version shaped by strategy. From the approach to the tower in the early morning, when they came up through the mountain pass with 8 men and found 3 Kingsguard waiting in the road. Arthur Dane, Oswell Whent, Gerald Hightower. 3 men who were among the finest fighters in the realm, who had made their choice long before that morning, and could not be faulted for standing by it, and who were none the less in the wrong place in service of the wrong thing. The fight had been brutal and short, and most of the men who went in did not come out. Howland said this without dwelling on it, the way a man says something true that he has said to himself many times and learned to carry without being flattened by it. He said how Ned had won not by being better than all three of them, which he had not been, but because Howland was still breathing when it mattered and had acted at the moment it mattered, and because Ned was the kind of man who could turn a margin into a result. He said they had climbed the stairs. He said what they found at the top. Lyanna Stark had been 17 years old. She had been dying for some time before they arrived. Howland was plain about this, because she would have wanted him to be. She had known what she needed Ned to understand before she was gone. She had told him, and Ned had promised. She was frightened, Howland said, not for herself. She was frightened for the child. She wanted to know he would be safe. She needed to hear Ned say it before she could let go. Jon was very still. "Did she love him?" he asked. "My father." Howland paused. A real pause, not a hesitation. A man actually thinking about the answer, rather than reaching for the convenient one. "I know this because Ned knew it, and it mattered to him, mattered enough that he kept it even when keeping it was hard, even when it made the world see him in ways he did not deserve." He held Jon's gaze. What came after? The war, the deaths, everything the sack cost. She could not have known all of it when she went. No one could have known what it would become. But she went willingly. And at the end, in that room, the thing she was afraid of was not herself. It was you. A pause. That is what love looks like when everything else has been taken away from it. It was not a clean answer, it was honest. Howland reached inside his coat and removed a folded piece of parchment. It was old, 17 years of careful keeping. Folded and unfolded enough times that the creases were soft, but the paper had held. She wrote this before the birth. She had time, and she was not a woman who let time pass unused. She addressed it to the child. She named him. She named his father. Jon took it. He held it in both hands and looked at the outside of it first, the folds, the handwriting visible at the edge, and then he carefully opened it and read. No one else could see the words. Arianne did not try. She watched Jon read his mother's letter and felt something in the room shift in a way she would not have been able to describe and would not have tried to. She had been for 4 years the person who knew more about Jon than he knew about himself. That had been true in the way that certain things are true, factually correct and morally uncomfortable and the best available option, regardless. It was no longer true. Jon held something now that no one else in the room had ever touched, and it was his alone, and she was glad. He folded the letter when he was done. He held it carefully in his hands. Doran waited until Jon looked up. Lord Reed's testimony, combined with the letter in your mother's hand, is proof enough to present to the Lords of Dorne. Not to the realm, not yet, not without a septon's record or a second witness to the marriage itself, but to Dorne's lords it is sufficient to move from secrecy to preparation. He looked at Howland. If you are willing to speak when the time comes. I came south to speak, Howland said simply. I made a promise 17 years ago, the same as Ned made. I have been keeping it at Greywater Watch while Ned kept it at Winterfell and you kept it here. He looked at Jon. Lord Stark kept his until the end. I intend to do the same. The room was quiet, in the way rooms are quiet when something that has been approaching for a long time has finally arrived, and everyone in the room is learning what it feels like to be standing at the place it arrives. Doran proposed the next step without rushing it, a formal declaration, presented first to the Lords of Dawn, then dispatched to selected allies. Not public. Not yet, but no longer hidden. The long patience was becoming something with edges, something that pointed in a direction. Jon held his mother's letter and listened. Arianne watched him. She had been watching him in one way or another since she was 9 years old, and she had always known something he didn't, until now. Now he held a piece of paper that no one else had read, words written in a hand she would never see, in a voice she would never hear, and she had nothing equivalent. She was not ahead of him. She was beside him, standing in the same light. It felt, she thought, like standing at the beginning of something that had always been coming and had finally arrived. She did not know yet whether she was ready. She suspected that readiness was not the point, that the thing simply arrived, when it arrived, and what mattered was what you did when you found yourself already inside it. Jon looked up from the letter and met her eyes. He did not say anything. Neither did she. They had, she thought, gotten fairly good at that, knowing when the space between them was doing more work than words would. Outside, the water garden's fountains ran, and the sea was visible past the wall, and the afternoon moved through Sunspear at the pace of a place that had been here before kings and expected to be here after them. The story came in on a Pentoshi merchant ship and traveled through 3 taverns in the Shadow City before it reached the Tower of the Sun, and by then it had acquired the quality of things that seem impossible until someone with a straight face confirms them. A Targaryen woman had walked into fire on the Dothraki Sea and walked back out with dragons. Doran heard the report from the maester, who had compiled it from the harbor's various witnesses, and he sat in his chair, with his hands still in his lap, and said nothing for a long moment. Oberyn, who happened to be in the room for other reasons entirely, heard it too, and then he laughed, a genuine laugh, the laugh of a man who had not expected to be surprised, and found the experience unexpectedly pleasant. It was the first good laugh the Tower of the Sun had heard in years, and it changed the room briefly into a different kind of place. Daenerys Targaryen, Doran said. Alive, Oberyn confirmed, still smiling. With 3 living dragons in a world that has not seen living dragons in over a century, he was already calculating, because delight and strategy were never separate activities for him. She was the girl sold to a Dothraki cow. She is, apparently, more than that. Daenerys Targaryen, Rhaegar's younger sister. Born the year after the divergence, carried across the narrow sea in her dead brother's keeping, raised in exile with none of the preparation or protection that the boy at Sunspear had received, and she had walked into fire and emerged with dragons, which was either the particular luck of old Valyrian blood. She was 16 years old. She was Jon's aunt, and she was, to all the world, the last Targaryen. Doran sent for Jon and Arianne. Jon's first response was not what Doran had expected. He said, "She didn't ask to be the last Targaryen any more than I asked to be the secret one." Doran said nothing. "She has been carrying that her whole life," Jon said. "Everything her brother put on her, everything the world expected. Because of her name, everything she had to survive to get to that pyre. She didn't choose any of it, the same as I didn't choose any of this." He was thinking as he spoke, reasoning in the open. "I want to meet her. I want to explain." "Explain what?" Arianne said. "That she is not alone. That there is a plan that does not require her to invent the whole of it from nothing." He looked at Doran. "She is 16 with 3 dragons and no one on her side who understands what Westeros actually is. She is going to make decisions without information. If she makes them without us, we manage the consequences. If we reach her first, if we reach her as supplicants," Arianne said, She has no reason to treat us as anything more than supplicants. She was not dismissing his argument, she was working the problem beside him, which was what she did now. She has dragons, we have Dawn's spears, and a secret the world does not yet know. Power acknowledges power, not sentiment. Before we approach Daenerys Targaryen, we need to be in a position to stand beside her, not beneath her. That is not where we are yet. Jon looked at her. He did not argue. He had learned over the past year that Arianne's caution was not timidity. It was the same material as Doran's, shaped differently. When she said wait, she meant something specific. We note this development, Doran said. We adjust the timeline. The declaration to Dawn's lords comes first. We do not approach Daenerys until Jon can approach her as what he is, and what he is must first be spoken aloud in this country before it can be spoken in any other. Jon nodded. He was still thinking about a girl who was 16 and had 3 dragons, and no one who understood the full weight of what she was carrying. He recognized the feeling from the inside. Oberyn found him that evening near the training yard's edge, where Jon sometimes sat after sessions to watch the light move up the upper walls and disappear. He sat beside Jon without preamble and was quiet for a moment. "There is something I have not told you," he said, "not because it is a secret, because it is mine. And I have been deciding when the time was right to say it." Jon waited. "Elia's murderers are still in King's Landing," Oberyn said. "Gregor Clegane raped and murdered her. Amory Lorch killed the children. The mountain still draws breath and still serves the Lannisters and has not been made to answer for any of it in 17 years. He said it without heat, which was more dangerous than heat. There will be a moment in what is happening there now, the wars and the factions and the things coming apart. There will be a moment when I can be in the room where it is answered. I am going to be in that room." Jon looked at him. "Don't. That is not a position I can take. What you are to this." Jon stopped. Tried again. "What you have been to me for 7 years, since the day you handed me a real spear and said from the beginning, will still be true," Oberyn said. "What I owe Aelia is older than what I owe your cause. Both things are true. I am not choosing one over the other. I am carrying both, and I have always known what the carrying would eventually cost." He looked at Jon directly, without the performance he sometimes put between himself and serious things. "I am telling you now so that you are not surprised later, and because I trust you with it." Jon sat with this. "It is already decided," he said. "Yes," Oberyn said. Neither of them spoke again about it. They sat in the yard's cooling air while the last of the light left the upper walls, and then Oberyn stood and went inside, and Jon sat alone until the dark was full. The Lords of Dawn came to Sunspear in the weeks that followed. Doran summoned them without specific cause given, only that a matter of the highest importance to Dawn required their presence, and that the Prince of Dawn asked their attendance in person. They came by ship and by road, through the threefold gate and into the palace, and they were housed and fed and received, with the ceremony Sunspear's hospitality required. Jon was not present for any of it. He stayed at the Water Gardens on Doran's instruction, and he accepted the instruction without argument, which was itself something Doran noted. Arianne was present. It was her first formal role as Dawn's heir, in a room that was doing real work, not receiving in her father's name, which she had done before, managing the room itself, the conversations before the conversation, the temperature of an assembly of lords who knew something was coming and were deciding what they thought about it before they were told what it was. She moved through the 3 days of it with what her father had been building in her since she was old enough to stand at his shoulder. The patience, the careful reading of faces, The understanding that the work done before a room comes to order determines what the room decides when it does. The Lords of Dawn left Sunspear with the feeling that something had begun. They did not yet know what. That was intentional. Arianne watched from the dock as the last of their ships cleared the harbor mouth. The afternoon sun was low, and the sea was going gold, and the ships were becoming shapes, and then smaller shapes, and then the kind of thing you had to decide to keep watching. He watched until they were past easy sight, and then he stood a while longer in the particular way he had been standing at the edges of his Lord's work for most of his life, present without intruding. Behind him, in the Tower of the Sun, Doran sat in his chair. The wheels were turning. They had been turning for 17 years, and they had finally found the ground to turn against. What came next would not be quiet, but it would not be nothing either. Turned from the dock and went inside. Doran Martell spoke first, which was, itself, the declaration. He had not often spoken first in his life, the pauses before his words were known among those who served him, and he had cultivated them not as affectation, but as tool. A man who does not rush to fill silence controls what silence means. He had controlled a great deal of silence in 17 years. That morning he filled it. He told the Lords of Dawn what he had kept from them since 283 AC. He told it in the order of events, without ornament, the Tower of Joy, the combat at Prince's Pass, Ned Stark riding south with a child and a secret he could not carry north without killing the child, the newborn given a Dornish name and placed at the Water Gardens, where children of all stations came and went, and no one looked twice at grey eyes. The 17 years of concealment. The letter from Lyanna Stark's own hand, which had been examined in this room already. He did not perform it. He stated it, and the Lords of Dawn listened, and when he finished, the room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet before a storm, when the air has changed, but the weather has not yet declared itself. Then Jon stood. He was 17 years old, dark-haired and grey-eyed, and he stood in the Tower of the Sun with a stillness that was not absence, but its opposite. He said his name, his father's name. He said they were married, in secret, in dawn, before the gods and before a septon, before the war ended. The child of that marriage was not a bastard, was not a ward. Was Aegon Targaryen, 6th of his name, and stood before the Lords of Dawn, not to ask for anything but to tell them what was true. Arianne stood at the front of the room and read Howland Reed's written testimony aloud, plain, specific, naming places and times, and the names of the dead who had stood at the tower's foot. His voice was the same, reading it as it was announcing anything else, level, certain, present. It was the right voice for it. A ceremony that sounded like ceremony would have weakened what was being said. The silence after held for a long moment, then a lord near the back, one of the more skeptical voices in the room, as Arianne had known he would be before he spoke, said one Cranogman's word in a piece of paper not yet tested. "We are prepared to have it tested," Arianne said, before the silence could fill with the wrong things. She was standing to Jon's left, and she stepped forward one step, not dramatically, only into the space the question had opened. "We are prepared for every step of that, and when it holds, as it will hold, what will your objection be then? Name it now, so we can address it now." The Lord had no answer to that. The answers he had prepared were for arguments, and this was not an argument, it was a sequence, and she had named where the sequence led. Another voice from the center of the room. "What does the Lord of the 7 Kingdoms say to this boy's claim? Dawn does not ask permission from the Lord of the 7 Kingdoms. Arianne said, "We never have." She let that sit for a moment. "We did not ask it of Aegon the Conqueror when he came with his dragons, and we did not ask it of any king who came after him, and we will not ask it of Joffrey Baratheon, who holds his throne by Lannister blades and his mother's arrangement, not by law and not by right. We adorn. We do not ask. We decide." She had been building toward this room her whole conscious life, though she had not known its exact shape until it assembled itself in front of her. She laid out the rest of it plainly, as her father had taught her, plainness as respect, plainness as strength. Elia Martell, raped and murdered in King's Landing with her children by Lannister hands, while Dawn's grief was answered with silence and the closing of doors. Dawn, which had been offered a position in the future of Westeros, and had kept that position safe in the Water Gardens for 17 years, and was now standing up to say, "Here he is. Here is what we kept. Here is what it cost to keep him, and here is what we are owed for the keeping. And here is what Dawn does next, which is not petition and is not patience, but the thing that patience has been building toward since the day Ned Stark rode south with a child in his arms." The room listened. At the back of it, Doran Martell said nothing. He stood with his arms at his sides and watched Jon, the boy he had taught to hold a spear, to square his feet, to take a correction without flinching, and return to the position as though humiliation had not occurred. He watched the composure that Jon had built in himself, not from instruction, but from some interior decision made when he was very young, and he recognized it the way you recognize things that were in front of you for years before the language arrived. He watched the grey eyes hold the room without appearing to hold it, and he thought, briefly and entirely privately, of Elia, not the way he usually thought of her, the specific grief, the specific loss, the accounting of what had been taken and not returned. He thought of her the way you think of someone when you can see the shape of what they are being honored by. Rhaegar's children had been her children. She had borne them and loved them and been killed for no reason that had anything to do with them. But this boy was Rhaegar's son, and he was standing in the Tower of the Sun and saying his name in front of the Lords of Dorne, and the secret that had been kept since the day after her death was finally being spent on something real. Oberyn's grief was not resolved. It was honored. There was a difference, and he had lived long enough to know what the difference was. The room reached its cautious ascent before the midday hour. Jon found Doran in the corridor, after Doran in his chair. The gout having taken full possession of him now, Hutter, behind with the chair's handles, and the steady expression of a man who requires no acknowledgement for what he does. Jon crouched down so they were at the same level. Doran looked at him for a moment. Then, "You were not what I planned. You were what was needed. There is a difference, and I want you to know that I know it. For the secret, for all of it." "I kept the secret for Dawn," Doran said. "I raised you for something more than that." He held Jon's gaze with the full weight of 17 years of patience and the particular grief that he had never set down and never pretended to set down. "Go find your aunt. She has dragons. You have Dawn. Between the two of you, you might be enough." Jon held his gaze for a moment. Then he stood and nodded and left Doran in the corridor with Hottar's watchful quiet and the afternoon's light coming through the high windows. Arianne was waiting at the orange tree near the water garden's wall, not the fountain, not the formal places, but the spot where they had sometimes sat when they were younger and the weight of the secret was between them and not yet named. She was 24 years old, and she had the quality she had been building since she was 9. The steadiness, the long view, the capacity to hold something enormous without letting it reshape her into something smaller. She had her father's patience and her own particular fire, and she had learned over years of trying to keep the two in conversation. Jon held out the spear, the one Oberyn had given him. Dark shaft, fitted head, balanced for a height that had been smaller when the gift was made. "Keep it here," he said, "until I come back." She looked at it. Then she took it. Then she held it back out to him. "Take it with you," she said. "I'll have one of my own by the time you return." "I have had one for years." He took the spear. "I will return," he said. "I know." She met his eyes directly, without softening it or managing the feeling with words around it. "I've been waiting since I was 7 years old." He looked at her for a moment. "So have I," he said. "I just didn't know what for." He left her by the orange tree with the sun going west, and she stayed until the sound of his footsteps rounded the far wall, and then she stayed a while longer, because leaving felt like the wrong kind of ending, and she was not finished yet. The ship was Dornish, and the name on the manifest was a Dornish name, and Lyanna's letter was folded inside Jon's coat. Obara Sand stood at the prow when he came up the gangplank, arms crossed, with the expression of a woman who had agreed to come and had clear opinions about what they were sailing toward. Nymeria was at the rail, watching Sunspear's walls. With the measuring expression she turned on everything she had not yet finished, deciding about not guards. Witnesses. That was how Doran had framed it, and it was accurate. The ship cleared the harbor as the afternoon thinned. Jon stood at the prow and looked back at the city. The Shadow City, with its layered closeness, the walls of Sunspear above it, and above the walls the Tower of the Sun, pale and high and still in the cooling air. It grew smaller as the ship found the open water. He watched it until the details went. First the windows, then the upper seams of the stonework, then the shape against the sky. Arianne stood on the dock below, growing smaller with the rest of it. He was still there when the ship took the angle that put the headland between them and the city, and the Tower of the Sun was gone. Doran was not at the dock. His gout kept him inside, in his chair, in the room he had governed from for 17 years. His window faced the sea. The story did not show him at it. It trusted the reader to know he was there. Jon turned from the city that had raised him and faced the open water. He was Aegon Targaryen. He had a name and a letter and a Dornish spear and 2 women behind him who had been hitting him since he was 13. Somewhere east across the narrow sea, there was a girl with 3 dragons who did not yet know he existed. He was going to find her. He was going to tell her, "You are not alone. There is a plan." The water was wide, and the wind had the ship, and the heading was east. He faced it, and let Sunspear go,